The infinity pool appeared to merge seamlessly with the dark Pacific Ocean, a sheet of black glass reflecting the stars and the string lights draped across the patio. From the second-floor balcony of his Malibu estate, Julian Vance watched the scene below with the detached precision of an architect inspecting a flawed blueprint. It was Elena's 35th birthday. The theme was gilded glamour, and the house was filled with the kind of people who measured worth in stock options and Instagram followers. Laughter drifted up, brittle and sharp, mixing with the clinking of crystal flutes. To anyone looking up, Julian was the enviable king of this castle, stoic, wealthy, and married to the most beautiful woman in the room. But Julian felt less like a king and more like a ghost haunting his own life. And he adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal Tom Ford suit. It fit him perfectly, armor tailored to hide the hollowing ache in his chest. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, not since the private investigator had handed him the final file. The folder, currently locked in the safe behind the master bedroom painting, contained high-resolution proof of what he had suspected for 2 years. Betrayal didn't taste like bitterness, he realized. It tasted like ash. "Julian!" The voice came from the glass doors behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He took a sip of his drink, sparkling water with a twist of lime, carefully disguised in a rocks glass to look like a gin and tonic. Tonight, clarity was his only weapon. "You're hiding," Elena said, stepping out into the cool night air. He turned. She was breathtaking. Her dress was a cascade of emerald silk that clung to her curves like second skin, the back cut low to reveal the elegant slope of her spine. Her blonde hair was pinned up loosely, strands framing a face that had once been his entire world. Even now, knowing what she had done, knowing how she planned to destroy him, he felt a pang of tragic longing. "Just admiring the view," Julian said, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor rattling his ribcage. Elena approached him, the scent of jasmine and expensive ambition wafting off her. She placed a hand on his chest, her manicured nails resting exactly over his heart. It was a possessive gesture, not an affectionate one. She was checking for a pulse, seeing if the puppet still had strings attached. "You look tense," she murmured, her blue eyes scanning his face. "Everyone is asking where you are." "It looks bad, Julian. It looks like you don't care." "I care deeply, Elena," he said. "More than you know." She frowned slightly, a microscopic crack in her perfect veneer. She didn't like his tone. It lacked the usual adoration, the desperate pliability she had grown accustomed to. She reached for his glass, took a sip, and grimaced. "Water? Really, Julian? It's a party. Loosen up." "I need a clear head." "For what?" She laughed lightly, a sound like breaking glass. "Talking to boring investors. Tonight is about fun. It's about us." Us. The word hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Before he could respond, a commotion from the patio below drew their attention. The crowd parted, creating a pathway for the newest arrival. It was him. Marcus Thorne walked in with the swagger of a man who believed gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. He was handsome in a predatory way, with dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket that was just loud enough to be fashionable. He was Julian's former college roommate, his first business partner, and the man currently sleeping with his wife. Julian watched Elena. He saw the subtle shift in her posture, the way her breath hitched, her pupils dilated, the involuntary step she took toward the railing. It was a biological reaction she couldn't suppress, a magnetism that made Julian's stomach churn. "I didn't know Marcus was back in town," Julian said, the lie sliding off his tongue smoothly. Elena composed herself instantly, turning back to Julian with a practiced smile. "Oh yes. He reached out yesterday. I thought it would be nice to bury the hatchet. For old time's sake. You guys used to be so close." "Used to be," Julian corrected, "before he tried to poach my lead engineers." "Water under the bridge, darling," she dismissed, her hand sliding up to straighten his tie. "Don't be a grump. Tonight is about celebration." She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for the weakness she had exploited for years. "Why so quiet?" she asked, her voice dropping to a coo. "Why so unhappy?" It was the opening line of the script she had written for tonight. She needed him to be the sour, depressive husband, the wet blanket to her vibrant fire. She needed a reason to seek comfort in Marcus's arms later, a narrative to feed their friends when the divorce papers were filed. Julian looked down at her. He thought of the nights she claimed to be at charity galas while she was in Marcus's penthouse. He thought of the text messages he had read, mocking his boring stability while they spent his money. He smiled. It was a small, tight thing that didn't show his teeth. "I'm not unhappy, Elena," Julian said softly. "I was just wondering why you invited him." Elena froze. For a second, genuine fear flickered in her eyes. Had she been caught? But Julian's expression remained impassive, almost bored. She quickly rationalized it. He was just jealous, just insecure. That was good. Insecurity made him vulnerable. "Don't be silly," she said, recovering her poise. "He's a friend, and we are civil adults." She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Now come downstairs, and for God's sake, have a real drink. Marcus brought a bottle of vintage scotch. He wants to toast with you." "Of course he does," Julian murmured. "Come on," she pulled him toward the door. "Don't ruin this for me." Julian allowed himself to be led. As he stepped across the threshold, leaving the cool sanctuary of the balcony for the stifling heat of the party, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. They thought he was the sheep being led to the slaughter. They didn't realize that the sheep was actually the butcher, and he had already sharpened his knife. "Lead the way, darling," Julian said. "Let's go welcome our guest." The living room was a cavern of noise and expensive perfume. As Julian descended the staircase with Elena's hand gripping his forearm, the atmosphere felt less like a birthday party and more like a gladiator arena disguised with orchids and velvet ropes. The guests were a blur of designer fabrics and whitening strips, a sea of sharks moving to the rhythm of a live jazz quartet playing in the corner. Marcus Thorne held court at the wet bar, a slab of black marble that dominated the eastern wall. He looked every inch the venture capitalist's success story, pouring amber liquid from a crystal decanter with theatrical flair. A small circle of sycophants surrounded him, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. "There they are!" Marcus boomed as Julian and Elena approached. The crowd parted, creating a stage for the confrontation. Marcus's smile was wide, bright, and entirely predatory. The man of the hour, or rather, the husband of the woman of the hour. "Hello, Marcus," Julian said. He kept his voice flat, allowing the weariness to show. It wasn't hard to fake. "Don't look so enthusiastic, Jules," Marcus teased, sliding a heavy crystal tumbler across the marble. "I brought this just for tonight. A 30-year-old single malt, peaty, complex, and unforgiving. Just like us, right?" Elena squeezed Julian's arm, her nails digging in slightly through the fabric of his suit. "Drink with him, darling," she urged, her voice pitched high enough for the surrounding group to hear. Marcus went to so much trouble to get it. "Don't be a buzzkill." The pressure in the room shifted. Several pairs of eyes turned to Julian. In their social circle, refusing a toast was a cardinal sin, an admission of weakness or hostility. Julian looked at the glass. The liquid swirled, dark and oily. It was the poisoned chalice, offering oblivion. He reached out and took the glass. The crystal was cold against his fingers. "To Elena," Marcus proposed, raising his own glass. His eyes locked onto Julian's, a silent challenge burning behind the friendly facade. "To the most magnificent woman I know. May she always get what she deserves." "To Elena," Julian echoed. He lifted the glass to his lips. The smell of peat and smoke filled his nose. He tilted his head back, letting the liquid hit his tongue, but he didn't swallow. As the group cheered and tipped their heads back to drink, Julian brought a cocktail napkin to his mouth in a feigned cough, expelling the majority of the alcohol into the linen before subtly tucking it into his pocket. He swallowed the remaining drops, grimacing as if the burn was overwhelming. "Strong," Julian rasped, playing the part. "The best always is," Marcus smirked. He immediately reached for the bottle. "Another." "I really shouldn't," Julian protested weakly, swaying slightly on his feet. "I have an early meeting tomorrow." "Oh, stop it," Elena laughed, taking the fresh glass from Marcus and shoving it into Julian's hand. "Cancel the meeting? It's my birthday. Live a little, Julian. Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a spreadsheet." The crowd chuckled. The humiliation was subtle, layered under the guise of marital banter. but it stung. Julian looked at his wife. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes sparkling not with love for him, but with the thrill of the game she was playing with Marcus. He took the second drink. This time, he waited. As Marcus turned to high-five a tech CEO about a recent IPO, and Elena turned to check her makeup in the mirror behind the bar, Julian moved with the fluid grace of a man who knew the architecture of his own home perfectly. He leaned against a large potted fiddle leaf fig, and with a slight tilt of his wrist, the 30-year-old scotch vanished into the soil. By the third drink, Julian began to slur his words. He loosened his tie, pulling the silk knot away from his throat. He allowed his eyelids to droop, his posture to slump. He laughed a beat too late at jokes he didn't hear. I think that one went straight to my head, Julian mumbled, leaning heavily on the bar. Lightweight, Marcus joked, but his eyes signaled victory to Elena. The effect was immediate. Seeing Julian incapacitated, their guard dropped. It was a microscopic shift, invisible to the casual observer, but to Julian, whose entire career was built on noticing structural stress points, it was glaring. Marcus moved closer to Elena. His hand, which had been resting on the bar, slid inches to the right, brushing against her hip. It wasn't an accident. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her body arching slightly toward him. Is he okay? Marcus asked Elena, his voice dropping to a murmur, ostensibly concerned but practically vibrating with anticipation. He's fine, Elena whispered back, her gaze flickering to Julian's glazed eyes before returning to Marcus's lips. He's just weak. He never could handle his liquor. Or me. They shared a look then, a look of shared contempt and naked lust. It was a look that stripped Julian of his dignity, his history, and his humanity, reducing him to an obstacle to be circumvented. Julian watched them through his eyelashes, his vision crystal clear despite the act. He saw the way Marcus's thumb stroked the silk of Elena's dress. He saw the way Elena's breathing shallowed when Marcus whispered something in her ear. The pain was a physical blow, a sharp knife twisting in his gut. This wasn't just an affair, it was a coup. They were laughing at him in his own home, drinking his liquor, planning his demise while he stood right there. But beneath the pain, the cold resolve hardened like concrete setting in a foundation. Let them feel safe, Julian thought, suppressing the urge to smash the glass into Marcus's grinning face. Let them think the fortress has fallen. One more, Julian announced loudly, stumbling slightly as he held out his empty glass, playing the fool to perfection. To friendship, Marcus grinned, pouring the scotch. To friendship, Julian. Drink up. To friendship, Julian repeated, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. He raised the glass, his hand trembling with a calibrated performance of inebriation. But his mind was miles away, drifting back through the jagged timeline of the last 6 months. The noise of the party, the jazz saxophone, the polite laughter, the clinking of crystal, began to recede, replaced by the suffocating silence of his memory. It hadn't happened all at once. There was no cinematic moment where he walked in on them, no scattered clothes on the foyer floor. The betrayal had arrived quietly, like a slow-acting poison, invisible until it was already in the bloodstream. Julian remembered a Tuesday night in November. It was raining. A rare torrential downpour for Los Angeles that turned the Pacific Coast Highway into a slick trap. Elena had come home late, claiming a charity board meeting had run over. As he helped her with her coat in the entryway, the damp wool smell mixed with something else. It was faint, buried under the rain and her own floral perfume, but it was undeniable. Cedarwood and expensive tobacco. It was a scent Julian didn't wear. It was aggressive, musky, the kind of cologne a man wears when he wants to announce his presence before he even speaks. Julian had paused, holding the coat for a second too long. Elena had flinched, a tiny involuntary spasm of her shoulders before pulling away. I'm exhausted, she had said, not meeting his eyes. Don't wait up. That night, lying in the dark, Julian had stared at the ceiling, trying to rationalize the scent away. Maybe she hugged a colleague. Maybe it was the smell of the boardroom, but the architect in him, trained to notice the slightest deviation in structural integrity, knew a crack when he saw one. Then came the digital breadcrumbs. Julian had never been the type to snoop, respecting the privacy of their marriage as a sacred boundary. But suspicion is a corrosive acid. It eats through boundaries. He started noticing the notifications lighting up her phone at odd hours. 11 out p.m., 1 out a.m. Always suppressed, always placed screen down immediately after. He remembered the afternoon he reviewed their joint credit card statement. Amidst the usual expenses, there were recurring charges for Uber Black rides to Brentwood. Elena hated Brentwood. She complained about the traffic on the 405 constantly. Yet, every Thursday afternoon, she was going there. Curiosity had turned into a morbid obsession. He matched the dates. The Uber rides coincided with Marcus Thorne's return to Los Angeles from his tech sabbatical in Tokyo. The realization hadn't resulted in rage. It had resulted in a profound, hollow nausea. Back in the present, Marcus clapped a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, jarring him from the memory. "You're drifting off, buddy," Marcus laughed, his breath hot and smelling of the scotch he was so generously pouring. "Don't pass out on us yet. The night is young." Julian blinked, forcing a sloppy grin onto his face. "Just thinking about the old days," he slurred slightly. "We've known each other a long time, Marcus." "Too long," Marcus agreed, winking at Elena. Julian looked at his wife. She was laughing at something the CEO's wife was saying, her head thrown back, exposing the long, elegant line of her throat. It was the same throat he had watched swallow lies for months. The most painful memory wasn't the scent or the money, it was the intimacy, or rather the lack of it. 3 months ago, the master bedroom. Julian had tried to initiate something, a touch, a kiss, a desperate attempt to bridge the widening chasm between them. Elena had recoiled as if he were a stranger. "I just don't feel like it, Julian," she had snapped, her voice laced with an irritation that cut deeper than any knife. "You're always so demanding." He had retreated to his side of the bed, feeling small and pathetic. Later that night, he woke up to see the soft blue glow of her smartphone illuminating her face in the dark. She was typing furiously, a soft, secret smile playing on her lips, a smile she hadn't given him in years. He had closed his eyes, feigning sleep, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to scream. He wanted to snatch the phone and throw it against the wall. He wanted to demand to know why he wasn't enough, but he didn't. He lay there and let the humiliation wash over him, absorbing it, storing it. He realized then that if he confronted her with just suspicion, she would gaslight him. She would call him paranoid, controlling, jealous. She would win. To defeat them, he had to become something else. He had to stop being the husband who loved her and start being the architect who dismantled a condemned building. "Julian?" Elena's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. She was looking at him with a mix of annoyance and worry. "Are you going to drink that, or just hold it?" Julian looked down at the glass in his hand. The liquid trembled. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Just lost in thought. You know how I get." He raised the glass again. He looked at Marcus, then at Elena. He saw the bond between them, an invisible thread of shared guilt and excitement. They thought they were the protagonists of a grand romance, star-crossed lovers outsmarting the boring husband. Julian felt a surge of cold power replace the old heartbreak. The love he had felt for Elena was dead, strangled by that blue light in the bedroom, drowned in the scent of cedar wood. What remained was simply a task to be completed. "To loyalty," Julian said suddenly, his voice a little too loud, causing a few nearby guests to turn their heads. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, his smile faltering. "To loyalty," Marcus repeated, though the word sounded foreign on his tongue. Julian tipped the glass back. He pretended to gulp it down, the liquid splashing against his closed lips, a few drops escaping down his chin to sell the illusion of a man losing control. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, suppressing a shudder that had nothing to do with the alcohol and everything to do with the man standing in front of him. The echoes of betrayal had stopped ringing. Now there was only the sound of the trap snapping shut. The toast to loyalty hung in the air like stale smoke, dissipated only by the sudden, raucous laughter of a group nearby. The party had swelled, the noise level rising to a chaotic hum of networking and narcissism. Julian swayed on his feet, allowing his shoulder to bump clumsily against Marcus. "You know what I love about you, Marcus?" Julian said, his voice loud enough to carry, turning heads. "You don't let sentimentality get in the way. You're a machine." Marcus chuckled, adjusting his velvet lapels, clearly enjoying the adoration of a defeated rival. "Survival of the fittest, Julian. Business is just biology with better suits." "Exactly," Julian exclaimed, gesturing wildly with his nearly empty glass. "Come on, I want you to meet Arthur." Elena stiffened. "Julian, maybe you should sit down," she hissed, her fingers digging into his bicep. "Arthur doesn't want to talk to you right now." Arthur Sterling was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the ocean with the bored detachment of a man who owned half the coastline. He was the managing partner of Sterling Capital, the whale Marcus had been trying to harpoon for his new hedge fund for months. A handshake from Sterling was worth millions. A frown from him was a death sentence. "Nonsense," Julian slurred, pulling away from Elena's grip with a clumsy stumble that masked his deliberate direction. He practically dragged Marcus toward the older man. "Arthur, you know Marcus, right? The shark of Silicon Beach." Arthur turned, his gray eyes assessing the trio with mild distaste. He was a man of old-school values, where a handshake was a contract and discretion was currency. "Hello, Julian. Marcus." "Julian is having a bit too much fun tonight," Marcus said smoothly, trying to distance himself from the drunk man while simultaneously positioning himself in Arthur's line of sight. "Happy birthday to Elena, though. Great party. We were just talking about—" "What was it?" Julian tapped his temple, feigning a struggle to recall. "Loyalty, ethics, that sort of boring stuff." Marcus's smile tightened. He sensed a shift, but Julian looked so pathetic, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, hair slightly askew, that Marcus dismissed the threat. He saw an opportunity to impress Arthur with his hard-nosed business acumen. "We were discussing the necessary evolution of the market," Marcus corrected, squaring his shoulders to address Arthur. "Julian here thinks business is about holding hands. I was explaining that sometimes you have to let go of the dead weight to keep the balloon rising." Julian let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Dead weight? That's good. That's rich. Like that partner you had in the San Francisco startup? What was his name? Ben? You cut him out right before the acquisition, didn't you?" The air around them grew instantly colder. Elena stepped forward, her smile fixed, but her eyes darting between the men in panic. "Julian, you're confusing stories. That was—" No, he's right," Marcus interrupted, his ego taking the wheel. He couldn't resist correcting the narrative to frame himself as the genius. He looked at Arthur, man to man. Ben was emotional. He hesitated. "In this game, Arthur, you know as well as I do, hesitation is expensive. I made the hard call. I took the company public. Ben got a payout, sure, but he wasn't built for the summit." Arthur Sterling didn't smile. He took a slow sip of his mineral water. "Loyalty is a rare commodity these days, Marcus. Some would say it's more valuable than an IPO." "Loyalty is a luxury," Marcus countered, emboldened by the alcohol and the adrenaline of the spotlight. "It's a romantic concept, but in high-risk venture capital, flexibility is the real currency. If a contract holds you back from the optimal outcome, you find the loophole. That's not betrayal, that's fiduciary duty to the winner." Julian watched Arthur's face. He saw the microscopic tightening of the older man's jaw. Arthur Sterling had built his empire on reputation. He despised cowboys who treated contracts like suggestions. "See?" Julian slapped Marcus on the back, hard enough to make the other man stumble forward a step. "A shark. He'd eat his own young if the margins were right. That's why he's winning, Arthur. That's why he's invincible." "Julian, that's enough," Elena snapped, her voice losing its sweetness. She grabbed Julian's arm, her nails biting into his skin. "You are drunk, and you are embarrassing yourself. We are going upstairs." "But I'm learning so much," Julian protested, widening his eyes in mock innocence. He turned back to Marcus, who was now looking at Arthur, waiting for approval. "Interesting philosophy," Arthur said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It reminds me of a fund manager I knew in the 90s. Oh? Marcus preened. Who was that? He's currently serving 15 years in federal prison for fraud, Arthur said quietly. Excuse me. I need some fresh air. Arthur turned his back on them, walking away with a finality that hit Marcus like a physical slap. The silence left in his wake was deafening. Marcus stood frozen, his smile faltering. He looked at Julian, suspicion finally piercing through his arrogance. But Julian was busy swaying, seemingly oblivious to the destruction he had just engineered. Oops, Julian giggled, bringing a hand to his mouth. Did I say something wrong? Elna looked at Julian, her face pale. For the first time that night, she didn't see a pathetic husband. She saw something else, a flash of something sharp and dangerous behind the glazed eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. You need water, Elena hissed at Julian. And you. She turned to Marcus, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. Stop talking. You're ruining it. He started it, Marcus muttered, sounding like a petulant child, his eyes tracking Arthur's, retreating back with panic. I'm just the life of the party, Julian declared, draping an arm heavily around Elena's shoulders, weighing her down. Come on, darling, let's dance. The band is playing our song. He dragged her toward the dance floor, leaving Marcus alone in the center of the room, holding his scotch, suddenly looking very small in the vast, expensive room. The seed had been planted. The water was tainted, and the dance was just beginning. The ascent up the floating staircase felt like climbing a mountain with lungs full of water. Julian leaned heavily on Elena, playing the part of the dead weight, forcing her to bear the physical burden of the husband she had already emotionally discarded. So sorry, everyone, Elena offered tight, apologetic smiles to the guests lining the hallway. He's just had a very long week at the firm. Too much stress, too little food. Poor guy, someone murmured. Let him sleep it off. Julian kept his head down, chin tucked into his chest, letting his hair fall over his eyes. He focused on the rhythm of Elena's breathing. It was short, sharp, and annoyed. Under her grip on his waist, he could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from pavement. She wasn't worried about his health. She was worried about her timeline. Every minute she spent dragging him upstairs was a minute she wasn't spending downstairs being adored by Marcus. They reached the master suite. Elena kicked the door open with a little more force than necessary and hauled him inside. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the sounds of the party, the clinking glass, the laughter, the saxophone, were instantly severed, replaced by the humming silence of the climate-controlled sanctuary. She didn't guide him to the bed. She practically dumped him. Julian allowed himself to collapse onto the Egyptian cotton duvet, letting out a groan that was half theatrical, half genuine exhaustion. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face pressed into the pillow that still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent she insisted on using. God, you are heavy, Elena muttered, the sweetness in her voice evaporating instantly. He felt her hands on him, efficient and impersonal. She tugged off his shoes, dropping them carelessly onto the carpet. She loosened his tie further, not to help him breathe, but to make him look sufficiently disheveled for anyone who might peek in. Then the mattress shifted. She sat down on the edge of the bed, right beside him. Julian held his breath, keeping his body limp. He waited for a touch of kindness, a stroke of the hair, maybe a moment of guilt. Instead, he heard the click of a compact mirror opening. "Look at you," she whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the silence of the room, it was deafening. Passed out before the cake is even cut. Pathetic. She sighed, the sound of a woman inconvenienced by her own life choices. You always ruin everything, Julian. You're just so present. Always watching. Always there with your stability and your plans. She stood up and walked to the vanity. He heard the sound of lipstick being uncapped, the soft snick-snick of a perfume bottle. She was refreshing her scent, the cedarwood and jasmine mix she wore for Marcus. Marcus is going to fix this, she said to his reflection in the mirror, though she thought she was speaking to the air. He understands ambition. He understands me. We're going to take the house, Julian. The lawyer said it's practically a done deal if I can prove emotional neglect. And look at you. Drunk on my birthday. That's neglect, isn't it? She walked back to the bed. Julian could feel her standing over him. I don't hate you. she whispered, leaning down close to his ear. Her breath was warm, smelling of champagne and lies. I just outgrew you. You're a safe harbor, Julian, but I don't want to be safe anymore. I want to burn. She placed a hand on his shoulder, gave it a perfunctory pat, like one would pat a loyal, aging dog before putting it down, and straightened up. Sleep tight, she said. The sound of her heels retreated across the hardwood floor. The door opened, letting in a brief burst of noise from the party below, and then clicked shut again, locking him in the dark. For a full minute, Julian didn't move. He lay there listening to the silence of the house, absorbing the finality of her words. I just outgrew you. It was the epitaph of their 10-year marriage. Slowly, Julian opened his eyes. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the sheer curtains. He stared at the ceiling, at the shadow of the chandelier he had designed himself. There were no tears. The burning sensation in his throat wasn't sorrow. It was the cold, metallic taste of clarity. He sat up. The motion was smooth, controlled, devoid of any drunkenness. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He stood and walked to the mirror where she had just stood. He saw a man in a rumpled suit, looking tired. Yes, but not defeated. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck and washed ashore on a strange island, only to realize he owned the island. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, high-tech voice recorder he had activated before they entered the room. He pressed the stop button. Her confession, her admission of the affair, the plan to take the house, the manipulation, was all there. It wasn't legally binding for a crime, perhaps, but for the court of public opinion and the morality clause in their prenuptial agreement, it was a nuclear warhead. Julian walked to the adjoining bathroom and splashed cold water on his face. He dried his skin with a plush towel, staring into his own eyes. The softness was gone. The architect who built homes for families was gone. You want to burn, Elena? He whispered to the empty room, his voice a low rasp that scraped against the silence. Then let's light the match. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and turned back toward the door. The party was waiting. The guests were waiting, and the uninvited guest was about to deliver his final gift. Julian descended the stairs with a quiet, lethal grace that was entirely different from the swaying clumsiness of an hour prior. He was an architect in his element, testing the structural load, making sure every floor joist could bear the weight of what was coming next. His suit was still wrinkled, his hair still slightly messy, but the eyes were clear, sharp, and entirely devoid of human warmth. He spotted them near the far end of the pool deck, beneath the glow of the landscape lighting. Elena was nestled close to Marcus, whispering urgently, her hand pressed against his chest. Marcus was nodding, his brow furrowed, clearly still smarting from the rebuke delivered by Arthur Sterling. They looked less like triumphant lovers and more like co-conspirators seeking shelter. Julian moved through the crowd, parting the sea of glittering guests with the silent authority of a man on a mission. The band was playing a slow, familiar melody, something romantic and utterly ironic. Julian reached the stage. He approached the jazz pianist, an older man with kind eyes, and tapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Excuse me," Julian murmured, his voice now low and smooth. A velvet hammer. "Could you pause for just a moment? I think it's time for the official birthday toast." The pianist, seeing Julian's composed, serious demeanor, immediately signaled the band to stop. The music died abruptly, replaced by a sudden, echoing silence that swept across the room. All conversation ceased. Every head, hundreds of faces, all familiar, all waiting for entertainment, swiveled toward the stage. Elena's head snapped up. Her eyes found Julian across the crowded room, and the color drained from her face. Her mouth opened slightly in a silent gasp. Marcus straightened, pulling his hand away from her hip, his own face a mask of confused apprehension. He was supposed to be asleep. He was supposed to be snoring away his shame upstairs. Julian walked to the microphone stand. He took the mic, adjusting the height with professional precision. He didn't look drunk. He looked sober, collected, and utterly terrifying. "Good evening, everyone," Julian began, his voice amplified, filling every corner of the vast house. His tone was not aggressive or erratic. It was measured, sincere, and captivating. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my remarkable wife, Elena, on her 35th birthday." He paused, letting the genuine applause build and die down. Elena watched him, her eyes wide with a frantic mixture of fear and confusion. She waited for the slurred word, the embarrassing meltdown, the moment he would collapse and ruin her carefully constructed image. But Julian only smiled, a politician's smile, warm but distant. "I've been thinking a lot tonight about what makes a marriage work," Julian continued, lifting a fresh glass of champagne, which he had politely intercepted from a waiter, high into the air. "We live in a volatile age. We're surrounded by temptations, by pressure, by the constant temptation to tear down what we've built." He looked directly at Elena, his gaze unwavering. She looked away first, her hands clutching the skirt of her silk dress. "As many of you know, I'm an architect," Julian said, shifting the narrative subtly. "And I understand that the most beautiful structure is nothing without a solid foundation. Our foundation, Elena's and mine, has been built on trust. It has been built on the promise that even when the outside world offers disruption, offers loopholes," he emphasized the word, a subtle knife aimed at Marcus, "we hold the line. We choose fidelity not as a restriction, but as the blueprint for longevity." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the echo of his earlier damaging statement to Arthur Sterling. "Elena defines that fidelity for me," Julian declared, his voice rising in volume and sincerity. He made his wife sound like a saint, a monument to virtue. "She is my center. She is the anchor that keeps me grounded when the currents of business and ambition threaten to pull me under." Elena's fear began to morph into a strange kind of relief, layered with disbelief. He was giving her cover. He was fixing the embarrassment he had caused. She started to smile, a fragile, grateful smile, thinking the moment of danger had passed. "10 years ago, I promised this woman my life, my future, and my absolute unconditional trust," Julian finished, his eyes sweeping across the room, encompassing every guest, and finally settling on Marcus. "And tonight," Julian said, his voice dropping slightly, imbued with an unnerving, emotional weight, "I want to celebrate not just her birthday, but the clarity that only the truth can bring." He raised his glass higher, his arm fully extended. The entire room was silent, anticipating the celebratory sip. "To the future," Julian toasted, "and to the moment when every single facade, no matter how beautiful, finally collapses to reveal the truth within." Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. He placed the microphone back on the stand, the slight metallic thud echoing in the expectant silence. He had set the stage. The tension was suffocating. Elena was half smiling, half trembling, waiting for him to step off the stage and give her an explanation for his strange, deeply unsettling speech. But Julian didn't move toward her. He moved toward the large retractable projection screen hidden in the ceiling above the fireplace. The retractable screen hissed quietly as it descended from the ceiling, pulling taut over the large Venetian plaster fireplace. The entire room, which had been holding its breath, let out a collective nervous murmur. Elena stared at the screen, a forced, brittle smile glued to her face. She expected a childhood montage, maybe a vacation video, the usual syrupy tribute. Julian pressed a button on a sleek black remote in his hand. The screen flashed to life, displaying not images but cold, clinical data. A financial spreadsheet titled, "Thorn Capital Unauthorized Dispersions." As an architect, Julian's voice cut through the silence, no longer amplified, but dangerously clear. "I learned that sometimes a minor structural flaw can be used to condemn an entire building. For the last 6 months, I've had the privilege of observing a fascinating case study in financial engineering." The first slide showed a detailed flow chart. Arrows tracked significant sums of money, tens of millions, moving from a seemingly legitimate venture capital fund managed by Marcus, through various shell corporations, and finally resting in offshore accounts under fictitious names. Marcus didn't need to read the details. He saw the chart and instantly recognized the signature pattern. His face went from confusion to utter panic. He had initiated those transfers months ago, confident in the complexity of the scheme, but he hadn't accounted for one crucial variable: Julian's quiet access to the deep architecture of the finance world, or the deliberate misinformation Julian had fed him through a third-party contact. You see, Julian continued, gesturing toward a line item that showed a direct deposit to a private account. Marcus here believes that loyalty is a luxury. He believes that finding loopholes is fiduciary duty. And I agree in part, except sometimes the loophole is a trap. The funds he believed were safely off the books were, in fact, tagged by my own forensic accounting team months ago, Marcus erupted. Julian, that's absurd. That's privileged. Quiet, Marcus, Julian commanded, and the sheer unexpected authority in his voice silenced the younger man. You're disturbing the presentation. The next slide appeared, featuring a magnified legal clause. The text in bold outlined the core of Julian and Elena's prenuptial agreement. Section 4, Marital Fidelity and Asset Division. It stipulated that any proven, deliberate act of adultery or deceit that causes emotional distress would render the offending party ineligible to claim any joint marital assets, including the Malibu property. The room gasped. This wasn't just business. This was public, brutal divorce theater. And this, Julian said, his eyes finally finding Elena, who was swaying as if struck. This is a blueprint for betrayal. My wife, Elena, promised me unconditional love and fidelity. Instead, she chose to use my trust and the anonymity of my house to pursue a highly profitable 2-year affair with the subject of our previous slide. Elena finally found her voice, a raw, desperate shriek. Lies! Julian, you are drunk. You are having a breakdown. Julian pulled the small voice recorder from his pocket and pressed a button. Elena's own voice, captured minutes earlier in the master bedroom, filled the silence. We're going to take the house, Julian. The lawyers said it's practically a done deal if I can prove emotional neglect. Marcus is waiting. I just outgrew you. The recording was short, damning, and absolute. Elena's face crumpled. She wasn't just caught. She was convicted by her own voice, in front of everyone who mattered. The evidence will be submitted to both the district attorney's office concerning Mr. Thorne's misappropriation of funds, Julian stated, his tone flat, as if reading a grocery list, and to the divorce court concerning Section 4. He clicked the remote one last time. The final slide wasn't a document. It was a simple notice in stark white letters against a black background. Notice of sale, 4800 Point Doom, Malibu, property sold. Escrow closed, 5 p.m. PST. The house, Julian announced, looking around the palatial room with detachment, is no longer ours. It closed 5 minutes ago. The funds are secure in my private trust. As for you, Marcus, he turned to his former friend, who now looked like a ghost. That small subsidiary company you were using for leverage? It was sold 3 hours ago. Your reputation, your leverage, and your freedom are all currently compromised. The collapse wasn't metaphorical. It was final. The room erupted into a cacophony of gasps, hurried whispers, and the frantic clicking of smartwatches as investors checked their portfolios. Marcus lunged forward, his face contorted with rage and fear. You bastard! You set this up! You waited! I am an architect, Marcus, Julian said, taking a deliberate step back from the approaching threat. I observe flaws. I calculate stress points. And when the foundation is rotten, I redesign the structure completely. You and Elena just provided the demolition permit. 2 large, silent men in dark suits, security Julian had hired hours ago, stepped in quickly and restrained Marcus, who was now screaming curses. Elena sank onto the marble floor, her expensive emerald dress pooling around her, suddenly looking cheap and theatrical. Her world, built entirely on vanity and calculated risk, had vanished in the click of a remote control. The room did not merely empty, it dissolved. The meticulously curated atmosphere of gilded glamour shattered, replaced by the ugly scramble of self-preservation. Investors who had been laughing minutes earlier now huddled, their faces illuminated by the frantic blue light of their smartphones as they contacted lawyers and fund managers. The silence that had followed Julian's speech was overwhelmed by the sound of expensive shoes clicking rapidly toward the exit. No one offered comfort. In this echelon of Los Angeles society, disgrace was contagious. Marcus Thorne, wild-eyed and spitting obscenities, was being expertly controlled by the two imposing men Julian had hired. He continued to struggle, shouting promises of lawsuits and revenge, but his threats held no weight against the cold financial evidence that had just been projected. "You can't do this," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with panic. "This is entrapment." "It's called due diligence," Julian replied calmly, adjusting his cufflink. Just as the chaos reached its peak, a new element entered the fray. Two official-looking men in dark suits, wearing the distinct, somber authority of federal agents, walked in through the main entrance. They scanned the room briefly, their eyes settling instantly on Marcus. "Marcus Thorne?" one of the agents asked, his voice low but carrying absolute command. "We have a warrant for your arrest concerning wire fraud and misappropriation of investment capital." The words sliced through the remaining murmurs. Marcus went instantly slack in the grip of the security guards, his bravado finally collapsing. Elena, who had been sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, looked up at the agents. The reality of the situation, not just a divorce but a criminal investigation, finally slamming into her. Julian watched the scene without emotion. He didn't gloat. He didn't even acknowledge the victory. The satisfaction he felt was clinical, like confirming the closure of a perfectly designed circuit. He walked past the stunned guests, ignoring the stares and the dropped jaws, and moved to the small antique writing desk tucked into the library nook. On the mahogany surface, next to a pristine vase of white orchids, lay two copies of a legal document. He uncapped the Mont Blanc pen he kept in his inner jacket pocket. With a steady hand, devoid of the slightest tremor, Julian signed the documents. The final, irrevocable decree of divorce. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper, a permanent severance of his name from hers. He replaced the cap and left the pen resting atop the signed pages. He looked up. Elena had struggled to her feet. She looked small now, stripped of the power the dress and the jewels had afforded her hours ago. She staggered toward him, her face streaked with tears and smeared makeup. "Julian," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, a desperate plea. "Please, it was a mistake. We can fix this. I love you." Julian looked at her. He saw the beautiful shell, the emerald silk, the panic in her eyes. But he didn't see Elena, the woman he had loved, the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams. That woman had died 6 months ago when he saw the blue light of her phone. His gaze held no anger, no hatred, not even pity. It was the detached scrutiny one reserves for a stranger on the subway or a failed element in a large-scale project. He looked right through her. "No, Elena," Julian said, his voice quiet, almost kind, but utterly final. "You wanted to burn. This is the match." He turned away from the desk, leaving the signed papers like a final receipt. He walked back toward the front door, the heavy, bespoke door he had spent weeks designing to perfectly frame the view of the Pacific. Behind him, the noise escalated, the hard click of handcuffs being fastened onto Marcus, Elena's raw, animalistic scream as she realized her life, her money, her home, her position, was utterly gone. Julian didn't look back. He walked out onto the paved drive, the cool night air washing over him. The valet, bewildered by the commotion inside, stood holding the keys to his sleek, dark Porsche. Julian took the keys. "Thank you," he said. He got into the car, started the engine, and pulled away from the house he no longer owned, leaving behind the chaos he had so meticulously engineered. As the car sped down the winding hill toward the shimmering grid of Los Angeles, Julian glanced in his rearview mirror. The lights of the Malibu mansion were already receding, becoming a small, isolated beacon of destruction on the dark coastline. He was finally free, and the silence in the car was the sweetest sound he had ever heard.